The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. My name is Doran Kess, and for 11 years I have worked as a signal analyst for the Galactic Council, stationed on a listening post at the very edge of what we called the quarantine zone. That night, every light on my board turned red at once. I had never seen that happen before, not once in 11 years. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of my console and stared at the readout. A signal was pushing through the null field barrier around the zone. Not a weak leak, not a flicker we could explain away, a clean, structured transmission, strong enough to make our shielding hum. I called my supervisor immediately. Her name was Talia Vren, an older Velen like myself, calm in a way that usually steadied me. That night, her voice cracked when she answered. "Doran, tell me you're seeing an equipment failure." "I wish I could," I said. "The barrier held for 60 years. Something just pushed through it like it was nothing." She went quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me to pull up the source coordinates. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed the command. The screen resolved the location, and my stomach turned cold. The signal was coming from the third planet, the one we were never supposed to hear from again. Most people in the Council do not know the full story of why the quarantine zone exists. They are told it is a precaution, a quiet policy from a long time ago, something about an unstable world with a fragile population. I used to believe that too, until I started working here and reading the old files. 60 years ago, scout ships discovered a small blue planet at the edge of known space. Its inhabitants called themselves humans. At the time, that world was in the middle of a crisis. Their climate was shifting rapidly, their resources were strained, and reports from the scouts described widespread conflict and suffering. By every measurement the Council uses to judge a civilization's survival chances, humanity should not have lasted another generation. The Council elders of that time made a decision. Rather than make contact, rather than offer guidance or aid, they built a barrier around the entire system, a null field, strong enough to block outgoing transmissions and incoming scans alike. They called it a containment measure. They said it was for humanity's own protection, and for ours, citing something about unknown pathogens and unstable biology. I did not know back then how flimsy that explanation truly was. I only knew that for 60 years, nothing came out of that system. No distress calls, no requests for help. Silence. Until that night, I sat at my console for almost an hour, running diagnostics, trying to convince myself the signal was some kind of malfunction. It wasn't. The transmission was clean, deliberate, and it repeated in a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. When our translation systems finally broke it down, we found something that chilled every analyst in that room. It wasn't a distress call at all. It was music, layered, complex, filled with instruments our systems had never cataloged, arranged in patterns too intricate to be random. Whoever or whatever was broadcasting it clearly was not struggling to survive. They were composing. Talia stood beside me, arms folded, staring at the waveform on the screen like it had personally offended her. 60 years of silence, she said quietly, and the first thing they send us is a song. I did not have an answer for her. None of us did. We reported the breach immediately, as protocol demanded, expecting swift action from Council command. Instead, what followed was a long, uncomfortable silence from higher up the chain. No orders, no explanation. Just requests for more data, more analysis, more confirmation of what we had already confirmed a dozen times over. It took 3 days before someone with real authority responded. A ship arrived at our station, flying Council colors I recognized but rarely saw this far out. Its passenger was an older Drailing delegate named Asen Mar, a stern, broad-shouldered official whose reputation for caution was well known across the analyst network. He walked into our monitoring room without a greeting, went straight to the main display, and studied the waveform for a long time without speaking. "How long has this been transmitting?" he finally asked. 71 hours, I answered. "It hasn't stopped." "Has it changed?" "No. Same pattern, same strength. It's almost too stable." Austin exhaled slowly, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that unsettled me more than the signal itself. He looked afraid. "Pull every file related to the original quarantine order," he said. "Everything. I want to know exactly what we were told, and exactly what we were not." That request alone told me something important. Whatever the true reason for the quarantine zone had been, the people in charge were no longer confident in it. I spent the next few hours digging through archived records most analysts never had reason to access. Reports from the original scout missions, council meeting transcripts, internal memos between elders long since retired or passed on. The official story, the one taught to every new analyst, was simple and reassuring. Humanity's homeworld had been deemed too unstable for contact, its people too fragile, its biosphere too dangerous. A protective measure, nothing more. But buried beneath the polished language of those old reports, I found something else. Phrases crossed out and rewritten, data points that did not match the public summaries. A single line, repeated in more than one internal memo, that made my skin prickle. Subject species displays resilience inconsistent with projected collapse models. Recommend continued isolation pending further study. Resilience inconsistent with projected collapse. In simple words, humanity was not supposed to survive. And when it became clear that they would, someone decided it was safer to hide them away than to admit the council's models had been wrong. I brought this to Austin immediately. He read the line twice, his expression unreadable, then set the datapad down without a word. "You understand what this means," he said finally. "I think I do," I answered. "We didn't quarantine them to protect them. We quarantined them because we didn't understand them, and it was easier to lock the door than admit that." He didn't argue with me. He didn't need to. That night, the signal changed for the first time. The music stopped, replaced by something new. A voice, calm and clear, speaking in a language our systems translated within seconds. A human voice, addressing no one in particular, as though simply testing whether anyone out there was listening. "This is Earth," the voice said. "We know you're there. We've known for a long time." The room fell completely silent. Austin turned to me slowly. "Get command on the line," he said. "Now." I did not sleep again that night. None of us did. Because in that single sentence, something fundamental had shifted. For 60 years, the Council believed it held all the power in this relationship, watching from behind a wall it built and controlled. But that message told us something none of us wanted to admit. They had known about the wall the entire time, and now they were the ones deciding when to speak. The days following that first message stretched into the strangest week of my career. I had expected the signal to fade, the way anomalies often do once properly logged and filed away. Instead, it grew stronger every single day, as though whoever was behind it wanted to make absolutely certain they could not be ignored. Austin Marr did not leave the listening post. He set up a temporary office in the corner of our monitoring room, running secure calls with Council command at all hours, his voice growing more tired and more frustrated each time. I was not privy to most of those conversations, but I caught fragments. Words like containment failure, words like unauthorized breach, and one phrase, repeated more than once, that told me exactly how nervous the higher ranks had become. "We need to know what they want before we decide what to do." The trouble was, nobody could answer that question, because nobody had ever actually spoken with a human being. Not once, in 60 years. All we had were old scout reports, decades out of date, describing a species on the edge of collapse. And now, a single calm voice on our monitors that sounded nothing like a species clinging to survival. Talia was the one who suggested we try responding. It seemed obvious in hindsight, yet nobody had proposed it until she said it out loud in a briefing. The room went quiet, several officials exchanging uneasy glances, until Austin finally nodded. "Draft something simple," he said. "Nothing that reveals our full protocols, just an acknowledgement. See how they respond." I helped write that first message myself, along with 2 other analysts. We kept it short, careful, deliberately vague. identifying ourselves only as a council listening post and asking the source of the transmission to identify itself formally. We sent it through the same channel the human signal had been using, then waited. The response came back in less than 4 minutes. "This is Nathan Cole, Communications Officer, Earth Unified Fleet. We've received your listening post signal for the past several days." We were beginning to wonder if anyone over there actually reads their instruments. There was something almost playful in the tone, despite the translation software rendering it in flat, mechanical phrasing. Austin read the message 3 times before setting it down. "Earth Unified Fleet," he repeated slowly. "That's a name for an organized military structure. That is not the language of a species barely surviving on its own world." He was right, and it terrified him. I could see it in the way his hands tightened around the edge of the console. Over the following days, more messages came through, each one adding a piece to a puzzle none of us were prepared to solve. Humanity, it seemed, had not merely survived the collapse the Council once predicted. They had rebuilt, expanded, and organized themselves into something far more advanced than anyone expected. Nathan Cole's messages mentioned things casually, almost carelessly, that made our analysts sit in stunned silence. References to colonies beyond their home system, mentions of fleet operations, resource management on a scale that implied serious industrial capability, and repeatedly, an unsettling awareness of exactly how long they had been isolated. "We noticed the barrier about 40 years ago," one message read. "Took us a while to understand what it was, longer still to figure out how to work around it without breaking anything. Didn't want to cause trouble. Just wanted to see what was out here." Austin forwarded that message to Council Command with a single line attached. "They have known about our containment field for 40 years and chose not to confront us about it. I do not know what that says about their patience or their intentions." The response from Command was immediate panic, thinly disguised as procedure. Additional ships were dispatched to reinforce the region around the quarantine zone, though not directly at the barrier itself, given how uncertain everyone remained about what exactly held it together, or what might happen if outside forces interfered with it further. Analysts from other posts were pulled in to assist with translation and threat assessment. And for the first time since I had joined this station, I saw fear ripple through people who were supposed to represent the most advanced civilizations in known space. I remember one meeting in particular, where a delegate from a species called the Thren stood up and demanded immediate reinforcement of the barrier before any further communication took place. "We do not know what we are dealing with," he insisted, his voice rising with each word. "A species capable of monitoring our containment field for decades without our knowledge, capable of organizing fleets, capable of casual conversation about matters of this scale. This is not a fragile world recovering from collapse. This could be a serious threat." Austin, standing near the back of the room, finally spoke up. "With respect," he said, "the barrier we built has already begun to fail on its own. If they wanted to force their way through, they likely could have done so already. Instead, they sent us music. They sent us calm, direct communication. If this is a threat, it is behaving nothing like one." The room fell into uneasy murmuring, nobody quite willing to agree or disagree outright. I sat quietly through most of it, absorbing every argument, every fear, every attempt to rationalize what none of us fully understood. And through it all, one thought kept circling in my mind, refusing to leave. We built that wall to protect ourselves from a species we assumed was dying. And now, 60 years later, that same species was speaking to us with the calm confidence of people who had never once felt trapped. It was during this period that I was assigned, somewhat unexpectedly, to a small analysis team tasked with reviewing every message exchanged so far, searching for any hint of aggression, any indication of hostile intent hidden beneath the friendly tone. I spent long hours reading through translated transcripts, cross-referencing tone, word choice, and structure against known patterns of deception or manipulation used by other species during first encounters. I found nothing, no hidden threats, no manipulation tactics, just straightforward, occasionally humorous, remarkably patient communication from a species that seemed genuinely pleased to finally be speaking with someone. One message stuck with me more than any other, sent late one evening by a woman who identified herself as Grace Ellery, apparently a senior diplomatic officer within their fleet structure. "We know you probably have a lot of questions about us," she wrote. "We have plenty about you too, but for what it's worth, nobody here is angry about the wall. Confused, maybe. A little hurt, if I'm honest, but not angry. We'd just like the chance to actually meet you, face to face, if that's something you're willing to consider." I remember reading that message and feeling something twist uncomfortably in my chest. Hurt, she had said, not fear, not hostility. Hurt at having been shut away and lied about for 60 years, based on assumptions nobody ever bothered to verify. I brought the message to Asen personally, hoping it might ease some of the growing tension in command. Instead, it seemed to trouble him even more. "They are choosing patience," he said quietly, staring at the translated text. "After everything we did, they are choosing patience over anger. Doran, do you understand how rare that is, even among our own allied species? Most civilizations respond to betrayal with retaliation, or at the very least, demands. They are asking for a conversation." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I saw something close to genuine dread in his expression. "That worries me more than any threat could," he admitted, "because it means they are choosing not to punish us, even though they clearly could, and that means the decision of what happens next belongs entirely to them." 2 days later, the barrier around the quarantine zone failed completely. It did not collapse violently, nor did it flicker and die the way older systems sometimes do. Instead, our monitors recorded a slow, deliberate power down, as though something on the other side had simply reached out and switched it off with practiced ease. Alarms blared through every station along the perimeter, ships scrambled into defensive positions, and through the newly opened space where the barrier once stood, sensors detected the first human vessels beginning to move. Not weapons, not an invasion fleet, simply movement. Calm, coordinated, unhurried movement, as if stepping outside for the first time in a very long while, entirely unbothered by whoever might be watching. I was assigned to the delegation that would make first contact, a decision that still surprises me when I think back on it. Analysts rarely get pulled into diplomatic missions, but Asen insisted I come along, saying my familiarity with the message logs might prove useful. I suspect the real reason was that he did not want to face this moment, surrounded only by officials who had spent the last week arguing about threat levels, instead of actually preparing to meet anyone. Our shuttle approached the edge of what used to be the quarantine zone, escorted by 2 council cruisers kept at a cautious distance, weapons powered down but ready, per strict orders from command. I sat near a viewport, watching the empty space where the barrier once stood, half expecting some dramatic show of force from the other side. Instead, what greeted us was almost disarmingly simple. 3 human vessels, moderate in size, elegant in design, arranged in a loose formation that suggested confidence rather than aggression. No weapons raised, no aggressive maneuvers, just steady, patient movement toward the meeting point both sides had agreed upon through the exchanged messages. Asen stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back, jaw tight. "Steady breathing, Doran," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Whatever happens in the next hour will be remembered for a very long time." He was right, though not in the way either of us expected. The meeting took place aboard a neutral station positioned exactly between the human vessels and our own ships, a compromise both sides had agreed to through careful negotiation over encrypted channels. I remember stepping through the docking corridor, my pulse hammering, uncertain what kind of beings I was about to meet. The old scout reports had described humans as fragile, prone to conflict, physically unimpressive compared to many council species. I expected exhaustion, perhaps even desperation, hidden behind whatever calm tone they had projected through their messages. What I found instead left me speechless. 5 humans stood waiting for us in the meeting chamber, dressed in simple, practical uniforms without excessive decoration or ceremony. At the center stood a woman I recognized instantly from the translated signatures on so many of our exchanged messages. Grace Ellery, the diplomatic officer whose words had unsettled Austin so deeply days earlier. She was shorter than I expected, with sharp eyes and an easy posture that suggested neither nervousness nor hostility. Beside her stood a man introduced as Nathan Cole, the communications officer whose casual messages had first rattled our entire command structure. The remaining three introduced themselves as advisors and support staff, their names slipping past me in the rush of the moment, though I remember one of them, a tall man named Daniel Ashby, offering a small, genuine smile as we entered, as if greeting old acquaintances rather than a species that had imprisoned his entire world for 6 decades. Austin stepped forward first, his voice carefully measured. On behalf of the Galactic Council, I extend a formal greeting and an acknowledgement of the unusual circumstances surrounding this meeting. Grace studied him for a long moment before responding, her tone calm, almost warm. We appreciate the greeting, and we understand there's a lot to unpack about those circumstances, but let's start simple. We're glad to finally be talking face to face. The simplicity of her response caught everyone off guard. Several council officials behind me exchanged uncertain glances, clearly having expected some kind of confrontation, some demand for explanation or retribution. Instead, humanity's representatives seemed entirely focused on the conversation ahead, unbothered by grievances that, by any reasonable measure, they were fully entitled to raise. The negotiations that followed lasted for hours, covering everything from basic diplomatic protocols to questions about resource sharing and mutual recognition. Throughout it all, I observed the human delegation carefully, searching for any sign of the fragility our old reports had described. I found none. Their questions were sharp, their understanding of council structures surprisingly thorough, and their patience remarkably consistent, even when council officials stumbled awkwardly through explanations that clearly did not satisfy anyone in the room. At one point, a Thren delegate named Ves Corin, the same official who had argued so forcefully for reinforcing the barrier days earlier, attempted to press Grace on the topic of humanity's technological capabilities, clearly fishing for information about potential military strength. Your fleet appears remarkably organized for a species that has been isolated for 6 decades, he said, an edge of suspicion in his voice. One might wonder how such development occurred without any outside assistance. Grace did not flinch. We had time, she said simply, a lot of it. And when you're cut off from everyone else, you either fall apart or you figure things out on your own. We chose the second option, Nathan added, with a faint, knowing smile. Turns out isolation is a pretty good teacher when you don't have a choice but to learn. The room fell silent at that. I glanced toward Austin, whose expression had grown increasingly troubled throughout the exchange, and I understood exactly why. Every assumption the council had built its policies upon, every justification used to maintain that barrier for 60 years, was crumbling in real time, replaced by the simple, undeniable reality standing in front of us. Humanity had not merely survived isolation. They had used it, methodically, patiently, to build something the council had never anticipated. As the hours passed, the conversation shifted, gradually, toward the heart of the matter neither side had yet directly addressed. It was Daniel Ashby, the quieter of the human delegates, who finally raised it, his tone gentle but direct. "We'd like to understand something," he said. "Why exactly were we quarantined in the first place? The messages we intercepted over the years gave us fragments, but nothing complete. We'd appreciate honesty if that's something you're able to offer." The room grew tense immediately. Austin glanced toward the senior council officials seated further back, clearly hoping someone else might answer first. When no one did, he cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "The original decision," he began, "was made based on assessments suggesting your world faced imminent ecological and societal collapse. It was determined that intervention or contact carried significant risk, both to your species and to established council protocols regarding fragile civilizations. Grace tilted her head slightly. Fragile, she repeated. That's an interesting word, considering nobody ever actually asked us how we were doing. There were scout assessments, Austin replied. Assessments made from a distance, Nathan interjected, based on data collected decades before any of us in this room were even born. I've read some of the historical accounts on our side. We know exactly how bad things looked back then. We also know we pulled through it, rebuilt, adapted, and nobody ever bothered checking back in to see how that turned out. The tension in the room grew thick enough that I found myself holding my breath, uncertain how either side would proceed. It was Talia, standing quietly near the back of our delegation, who finally spoke, her voice steady despite the pressure clearly weighing on everyone present. We owe you a more complete explanation, she said, even if it is uncomfortable to give. Austin turned to look at her, and for a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken agreement that honesty, however difficult, was long overdue. There are records, Austin admitted slowly, suggesting the original assessment was reconsidered, years after the barrier went up. Evidence began to suggest your species was recovering, adapting, even thriving, far beyond initial projections. Rather than revisiting the decision, certain officials at the time chose to maintain the quarantine, citing continued caution. Grace's expression did not change, though something in her eyes sharpened. In other words, she said quietly, you knew we were doing fine, and you kept us locked away anyway. Austin did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest. Yes, he finally admitted, that appears to be the case. I do not think I will ever forget the stillness that followed that admission. Not anger, not shouting, not the retaliation so many council officials had quietly feared. Just quiet, heavy silence, as 5 humans absorbed the confirmation of something they had likely already suspected for a very long time. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice measured and calm. Thank you for telling us the truth. That matters more than you probably realize. Nathan added, more gently than I expected given the circumstances. We're not here to start a conflict. We just wanted honesty. Now that we have it, we can talk about what comes next. I watched Austin's shoulders lower slightly, some of the tension easing from his posture, though his expression remained troubled. I suspect, like me, he had expected this meeting to end in confrontation, perhaps even hostility. Instead, humanity's representatives seemed intent on moving forward, carrying their grievances with a kind of measured patience that unsettled the council delegates far more than outrage ever could have. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Daniel Ashby offered one final comment that stayed with me long after we returned to our ships. You spent 60 years assuming the worst about us, he said quietly, assuming we'd fall apart, or worse, become something dangerous, given enough time. Maybe it's worth considering that the opposite happened. Maybe isolation didn't break us. Maybe it just gave us the space to become exactly who we were always capable of being. Nobody in the room had a response to that. I certainly did not. As our shuttle pulled away from the neutral station, drifting back toward council space, I found myself staring out the viewport at the 3 human vessels receding behind us, calm and steady against the backdrop of open space they had waited 60 years to freely enter. Austin sat beside me, quiet for a long while before finally speaking. We built that wall because we were afraid of what they might become, he said softly. I wonder now if the truth is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. What's that? I asked. He turned to look at me, his expression heavy with something between regret and quiet unease. Perhaps we were never afraid of what they might become, Doran. Perhaps we were afraid of what they already were, and simply refused to admit it. I had no answer for him. I only knew that whatever came next, the Council's carefully maintained illusion of control had ended the moment that barrier powered down, replaced by an uncomfortable new reality none of us were fully prepared to face. Back at the listening post, the mood had shifted into something I can only describe as controlled panic. Word of the meeting spread quickly through Council Command, and within hours, Every channel I monitored buzzed with urgent requests for full transcripts, translated word for word, analyzed from every possible angle. Officials who had never once acknowledged my existence during my 11 years of service suddenly wanted my direct assessment of tone, intention, and hidden meaning behind every human statement recorded during that first meeting. Austin called a private briefing shortly after our return, gathering a small group of trusted analysts, myself included, to review everything we had learned so far. He looked exhausted, older somehow than he had just days earlier, as though the weight of the Council's long-standing deception had settled physically onto his shoulders. "We need a complete history," he said, addressing the room. "Not the summarized version taught to new recruits. The full, unedited record of what actually happened on that world, and what the Council actually knew, at every stage of the quarantine." It took 2 full days of digging through archives, cross-referencing old scout logs, internal memos, and classified reports rarely accessed outside the highest levels of command. What we found painted a picture far more troubling than any of us anticipated. The original scout missions, 60 years earlier, had indeed found a world in crisis. Climate instability, resource conflicts, widespread hardship among the human population. Those parts of the official story were accurate, but the reports also noted something the public summaries conveniently omitted. Even during those early observations, scouts had recorded signs of remarkable coordination among human communities, rapid technological adaptation, and a level of collective resilience that defied every predictive model the Council relied upon. One particular report, authored by a scout commander whose name had been redacted from public record, contained a passage that stayed with me long after I first read it. "Subjects display an unusual capacity to organize under extreme duress, often achieving stability through cooperation rather than collapse. Recommend further observation before any decision regarding contact or containment." Further observation, not containment. The scout who wrote that original recommendation had believed humanity deserved a chance to demonstrate what they could become, given time and support. Instead, someone higher up the chain overruled that recommendation, opting for the null field barrier instead, sealing an entire world away based on fear rather than fact. I brought this discovery directly to Austin, who read through the report several times before setting it down with a heavy sigh. "There it is," he said quietly. "The moment everything changed. A scout commander recommended patience, and someone with more authority decided fear was easier to justify." "Why would they do that?" I asked. "If the recommendation was for further observation, why override it entirely?" Austin rubbed his temples, clearly wrestling with an answer he did not particularly want to give. "Because further observation requires continued vulnerability," he said. "It means admitting you do not yet understand a situation and remaining exposed to it until you do. Containment, on the other hand, offers the illusion of control. Build a wall, declare the problem managed, and move on to other priorities. It is far easier to hide from uncertainty than to sit patiently within it." That explanation settled uncomfortably in my chest, because I understood exactly how easily such reasoning could take hold, even among people who considered themselves wise and measured. Fear disguised as caution, control disguised as protection. It was, I realized, an old and familiar pattern, one the Council had likely repeated with other species throughout its long history, simply because admitting uncertainty felt far more dangerous than acting decisively, even when that decisive action was built on a foundation of assumption rather than truth. As our investigation continued, we uncovered further details about the decades that followed the initial quarantine decision. Periodic reassessments had, in fact, taken place, exactly as the records I found earlier suggested. Each time, updated observations indicated humanity was not merely surviving, but actively thriving, developing infrastructure, culture, and eventually, according to more recent assessments, technological capability that rivaled several established Council member species. And each time, the recommendation to maintain the barrier was renewed, citing vague concerns about premature contact, rather than any concrete evidence of ongoing risk. Austin presented these findings during a formal council session 2 days later, a session I was permitted to observe from the analyst gallery overlooking the main chamber. I watched as delegates from a dozen different species listened to the evidence laid bare before them, watched as expressions shifted from skepticism to discomfort to, in several cases, open dismay. The Thren delegate, Ves Corin, was among the loudest voices pushing back against the implications of what Austin presented. Even if the original justification proved inaccurate over time, he argued, the decision to maintain caution regarding an unknown and rapidly developing species was not unreasonable. We could not have known how humanity's technological growth might eventually threaten established balances of power. Austin met his gaze steadily. With respect, Delegate Corin, we did not maintain caution. We maintained ignorance, deliberately, by refusing to establish any form of contact or dialogue for 6 decades. Caution would have involved careful, gradual engagement. What we practiced instead was avoidance, dressed up as prudence. A Velen elder I recognized from earlier briefings, an official named Saren Voss who oversaw broader policy decisions across multiple sectors, spoke up next, her tone measured but firm. The question before us now, she said, is not whether past decisions were flawed. Clearly they were, and I suspect further investigation will reveal even more troubling details we have yet to uncover. The question is how we proceed from here, given that humanity has already demonstrated remarkable restraint despite discovering the full extent of our deception. That comment sparked a fresh wave of debate throughout the chamber, delegates from different species offering wildly varying opinions on how the council should respond. Some argued for immediate, full diplomatic recognition of humanity as an equal member species, citing their demonstrated technological and organizational capabilities as more than sufficient grounds for such status. Others urged extreme caution, suggesting the Council closely monitor humanity's continued growth before extending any formal recognition, fearful of what unchecked expansion might eventually mean for existing power structures within Council space. I noticed, throughout this entire debate, how carefully certain delegates avoided directly addressing the moral weight of what had actually happened. The lies told to justify decades of isolation. The Scout Commander's original recommendation, ignored in favor of fear-driven containment. The countless reassessments that confirmed humanity's resilience, only for those findings to be buried beneath renewed justifications for continued secrecy. It was Talia, standing quietly near the analyst gallery entrance, who eventually voiced the concern weighing most heavily on my own mind. "We keep discussing strategy," she said, loud enough for nearby officials to hear. "Threat assessments, diplomatic advantages, power balances. But has anyone considered simply apologizing, clearly and directly, for what we actually did?" The chamber grew quiet at that remark, several delegates exchanging uncertain glances, as though the idea of straightforward accountability had not seriously occurred to them amid all the political maneuvering. Saren Voss finally broke the silence, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that is precisely where we should begin," she said. "Before any formal negotiations regarding membership status or diplomatic protocols, this council owes humanity a direct, unambiguous acknowledgement of the harm caused by our decisions. Not a carefully worded statement designed to protect our own reputation, but genuine, uncomplicated honesty." Onquate. I watched Austin nod slowly in agreement, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, as though relieved that at least one path forward involved simple honesty rather than further political calculation. The session ultimately concluded without a final decision on humanity's formal status, though a smaller committee was established to draft a direct communication acknowledging the Council's role in humanity's decades-long isolation. I was asked to assist with translating and refining that communication, given my familiarity with the tone and style humanity's representatives had used in their own messages. Drafting that message proved far more difficult than I initially anticipated. Every version we produced felt either too clinical, too focused on protecting the Council's image, or too vague to genuinely convey the weight of what needed to be said. It was Talia, once again, who finally suggested a simpler approach. "Stop trying to make it sound official," she said, reviewing yet another draft I had prepared. "They didn't speak to us that way. Maybe we shouldn't speak to them that way either." I took her advice, stripping away the careful diplomatic phrasing in favor of something more direct, more honest. The final version, eventually approved by the committee and sent through the same channel humanity had first used to contact us, reads simply, "We built a wall around your world based on fear, not evidence. We maintained that wall for 60 years, even after learning our original assumptions were wrong. We are sorry, without qualification, for the isolation and deception you experienced because of our decisions. We would like the opportunity to move forward honestly, if you are willing to allow it." The response came less than an hour later, from Grace Ellery herself. "Thank you for finally saying that plainly. We're willing to move forward. Let's talk about what that actually looks like." Reading those words, I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not even realized was tightly wound until that moment. Whatever fear had gripped the council throughout this entire ordeal, whatever uncertainty clouded every decision made over the preceding days, humanity's response remained consistent from the very beginning. Not vengeance, not domination, simply an offer to move forward, honestly, together, if we were willing to meet them there. I hoped, more than anything at that point, that the council would finally prove capable of doing exactly that. The negotiations that followed took place over several weeks, far longer and far more complicated than that first tense meeting at the neutral station. I remained assigned to the analyst team supporting Austin's delegation throughout the entire process, watching closely as both sides slowly worked towards something resembling genuine partnership rather than the fragile, cautious arrangement I initially expected. It was not without difficulty. Several council species remained deeply uneasy about extending full recognition to humanity, worried about the long-term implications of welcoming such a capable and independently developed civilization into established power structures. Ves Corin, in particular, continued pushing for restrictions on humanity's expansion beyond their home system, framing his concerns as reasonable caution rather than lingering distrust. During one particularly tense session, he raised his objections directly to Grace, who had become the primary human representative throughout these negotiations. "Surely you understand our hesitation," he said. "A species capable of remaining hidden from our detection systems for decades, capable of organizing fleets and infrastructure without any outside assistance, presents legitimate concerns regarding future stability." Grace listened patiently before responding, her tone calm but firm. "I understand the concern," she said, "but consider this from our side for a moment. We discovered your barrier decades ago. We could have attempted to force our way through immediately, or worse, retaliated once we understood what had been done to us. Instead, we waited, observed, and eventually reached out peacefully, even after learning the full extent of the deception involved. If we were the threat you're describing, wouldn't we have acted very differently by now?" Ves had no immediate response to that, and I noticed several other delegates nodding quietly in agreement, clearly swayed by the simple logic of her argument. Saren Voss, who had taken on a leading role in shaping the Council's response throughout these negotiations, eventually proposed a framework that balanced legitimate diplomatic caution with genuine respect for humanity's demonstrated capabilities and restraint. Rather than immediate, unconditional membership, both sides agreed to a structured process of mutual integration, beginning with formal diplomatic recognition, followed by gradual economic and technological exchange, monitored jointly by representatives from both humanity and the Council. I remember sitting in on the final session where this framework was formally approved, watching as delegates from a dozen different species cast their votes, some hesitant, others clearly relieved that a workable solution had finally been reached. When the final tally was announced, confirming humanity's formal recognition as an emerging member species within Council space, a quiet murmur of acknowledgement spread through the chamber, though notably absent was any real sense of celebration. Instead, the mood felt more like solemn relief, an acknowledgement of accountability finally addressed, rather than triumph over some hard-fought victory. Grace, present for that final vote, offered a brief statement afterward, addressing the assembled delegates with the same calm directness she had maintained throughout the entire process. "We appreciate this decision," she said, "but I want to be honest about something, since honesty seems to matter a great deal in conversations like this. We're not entering this partnership because we've forgotten what happened. We're entering it because we believe moving forward honestly matters more than holding on to old grievances. We'd like the chance to build something better than what brought us to this point." Her words settled over the chamber, and I noticed Austin nodding slowly beside me, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering regret that I suspected would never fully fade, given everything he had learned throughout this process. In the weeks that followed, I found myself increasingly involved in the early stages of humanity's integration into Council operations, assisting with translation efforts, cultural exchange programs, and preliminary technological cooperation agreements. It was during this period that I got to know several of the human representatives more personally, including Nathan Cole, whose easygoing humor gradually became a welcome presence during otherwise tense diplomatic sessions. I asked him once, during a quiet moment between negotiations, how humanity managed to maintain such patience throughout discovering the truth about their isolation. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Honestly, it wasn't easy," he admitted. "There were plenty of people back home who wanted a much harsher response once we confirmed what had actually happened. Angry doesn't even begin to cover some of the reactions we dealt with internally." "Then why patience?" I asked. "Why choose diplomacy when retaliation might have seemed justified?" Nathan considered that carefully. "Because retaliation would have proven every fear you had about us correct," he said. "You built that wall because you were scared of what we might become if left unchecked. If we'd responded with anger and aggression the moment we got free, we'd have handed you exactly the justification you were looking for, even if it came 60 years too late. We wanted to prove something different. That fear wasn't necessary in the first place." His answer stayed with me long after that conversation ended, echoing through my thoughts during quiet moments back at the listening post, now repurposed as a joint monitoring station between Council and human personnel. Austin, meanwhile, seemed to carry the weight of everything we uncovered more heavily than most. During one of our final debriefings together, months after the initial breach that started this entire chain of events, he shared something with me that I have carried with me ever since. "I keep returning to that Scout Commander's original report," he said quietly. "Further observation before any decision. Such a simple recommendation, and yet it required a kind of patience and humility that fear simply would not allow. I wonder how differently things might have unfolded had someone possessed the courage to sit with uncertainty a little longer, rather than reaching for control." "Do you think we've learned that lesson now?" I asked. He considered the question for a long time before answering. "I hope so," he said finally, "though I suspect humanity's patience deserves more credit for that lesson than our own wisdom does. They gave us the opportunity to learn it honestly, rather than through conflict. Not every civilization would have extended us that same grace." Looking back now, months removed from that first alarm that pulled me from routine monitoring duty into the center of one of the most significant diplomatic events in recent Council history, I find myself reflecting often on what the entire experience revealed, not just about humanity, but about the Council itself. We built a wall around an entire world, convinced we were protecting ourselves from something fragile and unstable. Instead, we imprisoned a species that grew stronger, wiser, and more capable throughout every year of that isolation, choosing patience and honesty over anger, even after learning the full extent of the deception used against them. I think often about Nathan's words, about fear disguised as caution, and how easily such reasoning can take hold, even among those who consider themselves wise. I think about the Scout Commander whose recommendation for patience was overruled by those more comfortable with control than uncertainty. And I think, most of all, about Grace's simple, steady insistence throughout every difficult conversation, that honesty mattered more than blame, and that moving forward together mattered more than dwelling on what could not be undone. Humanity emerged from behind that barrier, not as the fragile, struggling species we once assumed them to be, nor as the dangerous threat some feared they might become. They emerged simply as themselves, patient, resilient, and remarkably willing to extend grace to those who had wronged them, even when such grace was not owed. I do not know what the coming years will bring, as humanity continues integrating more fully into the wider community of council species. I suspect there will be further challenges, further misunderstandings, further moments where old fears resurface in new forms. But I find myself, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely hopeful about what lies ahead. Because if humanity's response to 60 years of unjust isolation was patience, honesty, and a genuine desire to build something better, then perhaps the greatest lesson the Council ever learned was not about the dangers of an unknown species at all. Perhaps it was about the quiet courage required to admit when we were wrong, and the humility needed to do better, once given the chance.